So let's go ahead and jump right into our conversations. I am Dr. Nika White. I serve as the principal lead consultant for NWC. And every Friday we do what's called Intentional Conversations, which is a virtual community vodcast where we bring on guests as we intersect conversations dealing with diversity, equity, and inclusion, leadership, and business. And we're so glad that you're here with us. As I direct your attention to the screen, we have a couple slides we're going to take you through as we introduce some information. So let's go to the next slide for me, please. I'm so excited about next week's gathering. I'm going to be taking a step back next week, although I will be here, but I'll be backstage. I will be a student and I will be listening and allowing my colleague Natasha to step forward to lead the conversation on her own. And we're going to have two very special guest co-hosts, Michael Stevens and Melis Jakelu. And I'm so excited for them to be here. I know that we're going to have really good conversations. Natasha was able to spend some time with both of them at a retreat recently, and I cannot wait to hear all about that. That's Friday, February 26th. And then the week following, we have also another tremendous guest, Shaylin Jackson. That's going to be on March 5th again. And we're going to be talking about the importance of mentorship, how it's different than sponsorship, and the necessity of authenticity and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And Shaylin has just recently accepted a position as the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer for the city of Oklahoma City. And so super excited to have her even talk about that new role and how she's navigating the space in that regard. So join us on Friday, March 5th. For our conversation with Shaylin. And then as I've shared with you last week, I'm super excited about this upcoming spring book club that NWC is offering. Last year, we did a book club with Minda Harts of The Memo, and this year we're doing it with Karen Catlin of her book, Better Allies. I have it here, and those dates are actually going to be April the 22nd and then April the 29th. We'll have an evening session from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Karen is actually on the West Coast, and so we had to identify a time that was going to be convenient for her. But regardless of where you're going to be joining us from, I guarantee you it's going to be really rich conversations. If you're not familiar with Karen Catlin, she is the author of Better Allies, which is all about everyday actions to create inclusive, engaging workplaces. So she and I are going to be leading the discussions. Mostly I'm going to be listening and learning from her, but moderating those discussions as we also center your voices as well during those conversations. And so registration is open. We will also drop that into the chat so that you'll have that link. And we hope that you will consider joining us for our spring book club. Okay, next slide. And by the way, as we're going to the next slide, I just want to say that I am being supported today by teammates that are behind the scenes. I always like to call their names out because I'm so appreciative of what they bring to this opportunity that we can extend to each of you. And so I'm appreciative of Lindsay Morton, who is one of our producers for the Intentional Conversations, also Lauren Takei, a DEI manager with NWC, and then Anna Viola Gutman, our chief of staff. And of course, I've mentioned Natasha's name a couple times, so you'll be able to hear from her today because she is co-hosting with me, and I appreciate her greatly. So now it does me great pleasure to formally introduce our guest co-host for today, Sean Harvey. So as I always do, I want to give a formal introduction, and then we're going to bring him on just to greet us in his own way. And I'm going to ask him to share his story with us. And you all know that the story is what we cannot read in a person's bio. So hopefully we'll get some additional insight into who Sean Harvey is. Reverend Sean Harvey has a Master's of Organizational Development and a Master's of Education, and he is the Chief Compassion Officer and founder of the Symponia Institute for Global Compassionate Healing. Sean is committed to developing the next generation of soul-inspired bridge builders, facilitators, leaders, and change makers equipped to build compassionate bridges, redefine leadership models, reimagine systems and structures, and transform cultures. His work in personal, organizational, and societal transformation is inspired by over 20 years of talent leadership, organizational development, consulting, combined with a decade of college teaching experience at Cornell, NYU, Baruch College, CUNY in the areas of leadership, organizational behavior, and change. He most recently served as the head of personal transformation and well-being at Eileen Fisher, a brand many of us know. And prior to Eileen Fisher, he was the VP of Talent Consulting for Partners International. Sean holds a Master's of Education in Counseling with a theoretical orientation in existential psychotherapy from Fordham University and a Master's of Organizational Development from Loyola University in Chicago and a BA in Industrial Organizational Psychology from DePaul University. He recently co-authored an article with Dr. Judy Neal and Dr. Bonita Beaters-Reed called Nurturing the Soul of the Company at Eileen Fisher for the Journal of Management, Spirituality, and Religion. So help me in your own way to welcome our guest co-host, Sean Harvey. Place some great notes of just appreciation for him being here into the chat. And Sean, welcome. We're so glad to have you. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, well, it's great to have you. And as I mentioned before, we always like for our guests to share their story. What can we not find out about you by reading your bio that you are willing to share with this community?
I think the first thing is that I'm a bunny dad, and so I'm actually a rabbit educator, and I work with fostering and helping people understand how to adopt and take in baby bunnies.
That's so unexpected, but I love that. Bunny dad.
This whole conversation is about compassion. I think so much of my work, the name of the company, Symphonia is the Greek word for compassion. I think I've had bunny rabbits for about 12 years. Mm-hmm. And that was one of those things that actually took me to a place of compassion I had never expected. And so I think it's an important part of the story. It's unexpected. Most people don't think I'm going to talk about bunny rabbits and bunny speed dating and those sorts of things. But it's one of those unexpected.
Oh, love it. So you've already introduced the word compassion, and obviously, as you mentioned before, that is the Greek word for the name of the institute, and it's a cornerstone of your work. And so, why compassion?
When I left Wall Street and went to work for Eileen Fisher, we often talked about the culture and the environment as being of the feminine energy, but how it translated was as a culture of compassion. And as I've gone out into organizations post Eileen Fisher, I think the thing that it's often that's missing the most and most needed is this idea of compassion. How do we have compassion for ourselves? How do we have compassion for others? And how do we bring compassion into our decisions as business leaders, as organizational leaders? And so and then being in seminary and really seeing secular conversation around compassion and the spiritual conversation around compassion. And as an interfaith minister, seeing how compassion showed up in so many of the traditions and religions. It just felt like it was a universal truth that we don't tap into as much as we should. And it becomes an opportunity for us to bring that into organizations, elevate it for leaders, and express it for employees.
So help this audience to understand the nature of your work exactly. Give us a deeper dive into your practice and how in which you bring this concept of compassion to life for people, and even the different environments in which you bring this construct of what you refer to as soulful facilitation. So just unpack that for us.
I will start with soulful facilitation. Over the course of the work that I was doing post Eileen Fisher, I was seeing facilitation out and about in so many different ways, and oftentimes it felt more predictable. It felt like it wasn't going deep enough, and it was often very head-based as opposed to heart and soul-based. And when I started to think about my own approach of facilitation, there was a soulful element to it. And what I mean by that is being able to really tap into an intuitive knowing, being able to hold space from a place of deeper consciousness, let it come from within as opposed to come from the head, to relax the ego, So it wasn't about needing to be the sage on the stage, but it was really about actually what I would often say is becoming more invisible. And the more invisible we become as facilitators, the more powerful the container we create. And really putting the onus and the focus on the participants so that we're creating the experience for them to be able to tap into their own consciousness and truth, and let that emerge collectively to say, are there new paradigms and ideas that can come through the space when we're connecting in this way? And so that's really one piece of the work, which is soulful facilitation. Then moving to this idea of I hold conversations called the Compassionate Bridge Builders Call to Action. Because I believe we're at a moment in time when we look at the level of division that we're experiencing and witnessing, the level of disconnection from self and the disconnection from soul, and the isolation that's been just even exasperated by the pandemic and this need for human connection and human touch. That what before we get to systems change, before we get to new models of leadership, we just need to realize there's got to be another way for us to come together and connect. And I believe that's connecting from this place of really seeing each other in our essence and our deeper humanity. Now, why the compassion piece comes in is because for so many of us, if we have not done the work of deepening our own self-compassion, it's harder for us to be compassionate to others.
Right.
Because we're still operating from old wounds, old tapes, and expectations of how the world should be, as opposed to an acceptance of what the world is. And if we can, and often I say it's a compassionate bridge builder, because I often meet people who want to stay in the deep end and say, let's just be in our conscious communities. And I think that's great. But flip side of it is, as a bridge builder, how are we swimming from the shallow end to the deep end and back and forth so that we can meet people where they are and invite them into greater depths? And then we get nourished in the deep end, but then we come back. And so we're always in this place of service. So it's not about our own embodiment. It's not about just doing our own work. It's about how then do we share, as we do the work, how do we share that with others so more people can come along?
No, I'll go ahead and jump in here. Thank you again for being here, Sean. And I know that you just recently actually had the opportunity to film your own TEDx talk, and it was about and is about compassion makes the warrior. And I know we'll hear a lot about compassion today, but I was wondering if you could give the audience a little sneak peek or a trailer of what you talk about in that conversation. And it launches on Monday, just so you know, everyone.
Man, thank you. Yeah, the TEDx launches on Monday. I think so. So I'm part Cherokee, and I live in Asheville, North Carolina for the time being, so on the land of the Cherokee people. And my grandfather, my Cherokee grandfather, who was a decorated veteran under General Patton in World War II, and he hauled steel for the Big Three in Detroit. But every night before bed, he would tell me the stories of Little Red Chief. And Little Red Chief was a Cherokee boy who was really going through his own journey of coming into his essence as a compassionate warrior. And my grandfather would always tell me these stories and the challenges of what can get in the way of us becoming. And I was 4 years old when he would tell me this. So it was deeply embedded. And he would tell me this for two reasons. One, he would share that as I grow up as a white man, to never forget that I have indigenous blood. And two, that no matter what life throws at me, that at my essence and at my core, I'm a compassionate warrior, and I have the ability to be compassionate in the world and fight for justice and fight for what's right, and to see everyone in their humanity and their essence. And so that's where the talk starts. And then I define what it is. And, I really see a compassionate warrior as anyone across the gender continuum who is ready and courageous enough to do their own honest, rigorous exploration of who they are, looking at their core wounding, and then being willing to do the healing work that's going to allow them to become whole and integrated. And from that place, I think being able to embrace the parts of ourselves that exist in shame and fear and past trauma, that's actually where we start to deepen our level and our ability to tap into our compassion, because we have to learn to love ourselves to be able to overcome those wounds. And when we come from a place of healing, that's when we can be in the world, being able to fight for justice, bring organizations that are ethical. And in some of my work, I'm also starting to build a model of working with the police and law enforcement. And in the military, I'm bringing a compassionate perspective into the ways these systems and institutions operate. But from that place, when we are trying to do this work from our wounding, we're often screaming because we're coming from the trauma, or we're coming from not having a voice. When we come from a place of healing, we often can be heard in a way that can be received. Mm-hmm. And so it becomes this, what is our own, what are the choices we're making? What's the work that we're doing, so that we can show up in the way that we can have the greatest amount of impact?
Mm-hmm. And you touched a little bit on this, but could you talk about and amplify the power of our own inner self-compassion?
Can you what's the question behind that question?
So what's the need for us to be compassionate to our own selves?
Mm-hmm. You know, I heard it today, and I hear this statement: when it's you, yourself, and you're often in your head, you're behind enemy lines, because our tapes can be so destructive. Our conditioning can limit us in a way that we are so operating in the shoulds that we forget we don't have access to who we actually are. Mm-hmm. And so that's often where our masks come in. And when we operate from living in the mask and living in the, I'm going to perform so people will like me, or because society tells me this is what I should do. And I think the compassion and the self-love is actually asking the question, who am I? Mm-hmm. Who am I authentically? How do I want to be? Not who should I be? What is my authentic expression? And then from that place, what is my sense of purpose? And what is my way to contribute in the world? Mm-hmm. So I think compassion becomes the permission. And I'll tell you a story of the breaking point for me, the turning point for me, I should say, the breakthrough moment. So for me, I was living, my life was pretty much about looking good on paper. And so that was how I knew that I could be a good human being, was if I look good on paper. And so that led me to become a college professor. That led me to work on Wall Street. And that led me to be miserable. And I was dealing with, while I was looking good on paper, my personal life was anemic. I was struggling with addiction. I was struggling with Lone Ranger syndrome. I was struggling with isolation and loneliness. And so I was doing a great job of masking my reality of my personal life and my failed relationships, my lack of friendships, whatever that was. And on my 40th birthday, I had enough, and I walked into my CEO's office of the consulting firm where I worked, and I resigned as my birthday present. Within a few weeks, the opportunity at Eileen Fisher opened up. And a friend of mine who worked there was, she was telling me about it. And I had never heard of Eileen Fisher before those conversations. Didn't know what this organization was. I mean, I was a guy on Wall Street, you know? I was like, but what I realized is, as an organization development practitioner, as a systems thinker, as she was describing what Eileen Fisher was doing, it was everything that I was trying to sell as a consultant, they were already doing as a company. Mm. And so I said, I have to know who this company is. So I applied, and I went through an 8-month interview process. Mm. But it was what happened in that next moment, which is when I got the offer, my two bosses sat me down at lunch on my first day and said, Sean, you have proven yourself in the interview process. We now want you to stop proving yourself and learn to be who you authentically are. You showed us your polish and you showed us your heart. We hired you for your heart. We want to see less of your polish. And we're going to support you in that journey. So first of all, I was like, who does this? Who says this in corporate America?
Right.
But two, this is permission to get messy and to look at myself. And it was while I was at Island Fisher for 5 years, there were some really messy moments where I had to look at the ways I was in my ego. I had to look at the ways I was in my bias. I had to look at the ways I was in my male privilege. I had to look at the ways I was in my white male privilege. And really ask myself, where's my ego? Where's my bias? How am I holding space for others? You know, one of the recommendations I had for all men at Eileen Fisher was that because the company was 83% women, that we each institute our own 7-second rule. So whenever we're in a meeting, we hold back for 7 seconds so other voices can come in. And depending on where you are on the privilege scale, hold back even further. Because usually it's that first voice that sets the precedent for where the conversation goes. And often I found that when women are bringing the conversation in, they're bringing that feminine energy. And they're often bringing the healing energy as opposed to the fixing energy. And that often provides us with the opportunity to hear it from a different perspective. And so that moment, though, of being told to come into my authentic self, that was the moment I think that everything in my life changed. And I went on this crazy journey that I'm on now.
I'm holding on to your every word, and I'm just looking at the chat, and so many people are really appreciating this conversation. So I do hope you'll have a chance to go back and revisit the chat. But this message of compassion is so relevant, as people in this community have been amplifying, not only when we think about the global pandemic, but our hearts go out to all of the people in Texas right now that are really struggling with the weather issues. And compassion is something that we need more of, and we need more of in every space. And so I love that this is the center of your work, and that it even finds its way into spaces like the corporate realm, where a lot of people feel like that belongs outside, of that environment. And I think it needs to be right in the center, which is certainly something that you amplified. You touched a little earlier, Sean, on healing and reconciliation work. And you and I, when we first connected, we had this conversation about how healing and reconciliation also intersects very, very much with the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because oftentimes part of what needs to occur before you really can be effective at diversity, equity, and inclusion work is healing and reconciling people to a place where they can rebuild that trust and rebuild that sense of safety. So just talk about what you understand the intersection to be of the work you do, very specifically to best practices regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I remember that conversation well. And, as I said to you in my cynical view, I think a lot of times when we're doing DE&I work, we're often giving people we're asking people to shift behaviors, raise awareness to shift behaviors. That doesn't necessarily shift hearts and change mindset. Right. It's like, okay, I know what I can get away with, so I don't get fired. For a lot of folks. But the question is, how do we actually change the hearts? And so I think the compassion work is often the beginning work. It's the beginning work to understand, where do I have bias? It's where do I have unrealistic expectations of myself that I create judgment for everyone else? Right? So how do I start to reduce the judgment? How do I start to move into a place of acceptance? How do I move into a place of surrender that I don't have all the answers? This is part of the compassion work. Then I think it's to really ask, oftentimes in our wounding is often where we find the hate.
Yeah.
And so as an interfaith minister, not a Christian minister, um, but through the teachings of Christ, the real message is love.
Mm-hmm.
And life being a transforming power, that if we are able to start to come into a new relationship with what love is, which is at the basis of true compassion. And what I like to say about compassion is I think a lot of us intellectualize what compassion is. I think we are in our heads about what compassion is, but the real opportunity is when we can feel what compassion is. And so it's not about giving a PowerPoint display of 10 things of how to be compassionate. It's maybe giving 10 experiences of what's going to make you feel for yourself and for others, and the suffering that can happen, and how we can move beyond that so we can prevent suffering in the world. Mm-hmm. And so I think that that's the beginning work, and then we can start to look at, once I've moved to that place out of judgment, I can start to then honestly say, where do I have biases?
Mm-hmm.
Where do I see this person as either different, inferior, or superior to me? And how do I move that to, we are humans who at the end of the day, and I was in an experience that I went this year where we had 38 people in the room, and we were doing this exercise on unmet needs. And really the core unmet need came down to probably 5 to 6 things: to be seen, heard, valued, loved, included. If we can look at each beautiful human in front of us and say, that person has one of 5 to 7 needs, or all 7. And then everything else in life has then started to layer on top of those needs. But if we can go to the core essence of who this person is and see them from that light, we start to see them in their essence. And I think compassion also allows us to see others in their shadow, but to see a love for them and that they're on their journey, as opposed to judging them that that's all they can do. And so I think this idea of also understanding human potential, that we are all on some sort of journey, whether we are conscious of it or not, but on that journey, we are able to grow, evolve, and mature. And so to see that this person that I'm meeting is right here, but they have the potential to be here. So let me give them love, let me give them understanding, and let me give them compassion for where they are in their journey and where they're going, even if I see hate in their heart.
I put those 5 core needs into the chats. People want to be seen, heard, valued, loved, and included. That's so powerful, and it's so simple in words, but it's so profound in the experience that people can feel when that's happening for them. I don't know about each of you, but I'm feeling such a this tranquil calm just by being, part of this conversation, and it's really interesting. So I'm going to yield to Natasha now, because I want to digest a little bit of what you just shared. It was really good, Sean.
Thanks, Nika.
Yeah, I had a question, Sean. You're talking about the love and the spirituality of each individual, which I absolutely agree with and stand with you. I'm wondering how, when you're working with organizations and government agencies, or even the police department you mentioned, how do you translate to them that love and that compassion so that they understand it's needed in the workplace, and turn that into ROI, if you will, if they can't process it any other way? How do you approach that conversation?
I think that's a great question, because it's what I tell the Soulful Facilitators all the time. We often operate in the world, especially in organizations, around techniques, tools, strategies. And I often operate from downloads, rituals, ceremonies, and presence and way of being. And that's what I want to focus on. We often underestimate, especially when we are holding space, presenting, facilitating, that it's that what we say has much less to do with how we present. And so how we present is, are we coming from a place of groundedness? Are we coming from a place of calm? And are we coming from a place of love? That presence is, I think, the starting place. Then all of our gadgets and our techniques and our tools, that plays on it. But if we're coming in agitated, thinking about content, or getting it right, then that's going to be the driving energy in the space. And what I often find is if a facilitator is coming in from the head, the room is going to be in the head. If the facilitator is coming from the heart, you're giving permission for the room to go to the heart. And when I was at Eileen Fisher, I was sent to an artist commune for 5 months to incorporate the arts into creative facilitation. And one of the things the facilitator said is the room is only capable of going as deep as the facilitator is able. And so that was always then the way for me to just keep doing my inner work and going to that deeper place. So I think that's the first thing, presence. The second thing I would say is understand the culture and understand what language can work without losing the integrity of the message. I think what I see so many consultants do, and internal consultants, is they water it down to the CFO and they lose the integrity of the actual teeth of the work. So I think it's the discernment process that each of us has to say, what's going to land for this audience? And at the same time, what can we bring to the audience, and and how do we not lose the essence of what we're trying to do? And I think in terms of ROI, you can start to look at what is the attraction, what are the attraction rates, what are the retention rates, what are the level of issues that employees are having, what are the complaints against leaders. I think you can translate it, but often I say the ROI conversation is not necessarily the first conversation we should be having.
Yeah.
I think the first thing we should be doing is actually finding the enlightened leaders who are open to piloting, prototyping, and testing out, and experimenting with new ideas. And there's what's measurable, and then there's what's the essence and the energy that's created by that group in terms of the performance that they can create. Then their peers are going to say, "Hey, what did you do? You're doing something right. I want to know more about that." So I often approach it from that perspective.
I love that, Sean. What you've touched on is translating spirituality into the ROI for business and government agencies. And that's not something that is spoken of quite often. But I do appreciate the innovation and the charge, the call to action. I heard on what you just said was really a call to action. Leaders need to be more open to other ways of being able to drive this level of compassion and empathy in the workplace. And that leads to some great benefits from an overall output perspective. So what does it mean to bring a soul-inspired approach to personal, organizational, and societal transformation?
Again, it's way of being. I think it's giving. When I was at Eileen Fisher, I was part of a mindfulness leaders group that included a number of Fortune 50 companies and then Eileen Fisher. So we were always at the cutting edge. We were always at the edge that we could just do. We could do what we. Eileen basically said, "I want you all to do this," so we just did it. We didn't have to prove our work. Yeah, when I was working with these Fortune 50 companies, they were saying, what are our metrics? What are our objectives? How do we sell mindfulness? But what I took from that conversation is these are all very spiritually driven people. Yet they were trying to translate it into awareness, attention, and concepts that made sense in business. But we would start to have these conversations. I'm like, I think one of the things that we have to do is unapologetically allow ourselves to be soulful. We can translate it in any way. And actually, one of the folks invited me into their organization, which was a logistics and a high manufacturing company. And she's like, I don't know if the soulfulness is going to land here. Like, and I'm like, well, we don't have to use the language. You know, I created the same version of the same experience for a financial services firm, and we called it integrated facilitation, mind, body, spirit. You know, and so I said, it doesn't matter what we call it because you're still hiring me. I can't be any other way but soulful. And it's not that I'm doing the gadgets and the techniques and all that. I'm really just bringing in a way of being that I can be with whatever's coming into the space. I can flow with that energy. I can relax my ego. And I can have love and compassion for each person in the space. You know, when I was a college professor, I taught at Baruch for about 8 years. And so Baruch is considered the most ethnically diverse college in the country. They have 144 ethnicities represented. And pretty much all were first-generation college kids. And I taught there. I taught org behavior, org change. As I was teaching it, on the first day, I was always like, a couple of things I always did. I gave an 8-page syllabus so students could have an informed choice of if they wanted to stay or go. And I always said, if this is not for you, then I'm going to give you permission to leave without question. The second thing is I get that life happens. And so as long as you come to me, I will always work with you and never penalize you if something comes up, because life happens. You work, you have kids, you have families, and this is hard. But the third thing I did is by the end of the first class, every semester, I would memorize and tell every student their name before they left. So they knew that they had been heard and they'd been seen, and their name was brought into the space. And I think those are acts of love and compassion and care. And so I think part of what we're talking about is bringing a sense of care to others, bringing a sense of love to others, and bringing a sense of, as life happens, that we're with you, we're not judging you, or we're not going to run away from you. And we're not going to penalize you.
And I'll add, saying someone's name is a small act, but it can be a very large act. It can make someone feel loved, seen, valued, heard. And so, yes, just saying someone's name and acknowledging them is important. But we'll go ahead, and we have a few questions that have come through, and we'd love to get to those. So this first question, Sean, came from Marcel, and it's, I agree that self-compassion and working on ourselves is important. I'm curious what collective community healing looks like. How do we as a community facilitate self-compassion in each of us together?
So I led a conversation yesterday with 22 people called Bridges Built from Unconditional Love. And we talked about the distinction between love with conditions versus love without conditions, and the unconditional love, which is the true love. So to that question, I think first, let's stop sugarcoating and stop trying to beat around and dance around what's real. 2, let's name what's actually happening in the space. 3, let's create a safety, but also for a courageous acts of speaking truth that is held without commentary and that is held with a sense of care that we co-create together, that's not held just by the facilitator. What I've found is when we bring a presence into the space, when we bring that the honesty, and we also talk about the pain that's either coming from individual trauma, collective trauma, historical trauma, ancestral trauma, whatever that is, that we are aware that it's in the space. We don't try to hide from it in the space, and we don't, as the facilitators or space holders, perpetuate it because we're blind to our own triggers and our own inner agitation. But it really, I believe, if we want to create those communities, it's setting the agreements up front and doing the work together to be able to hold this space collectively, not just leaving it on one or two people.
Agreed. You can't rely on one or two people. It's really about the collective and creating that community, because if it all falls on one person, it's too much of a weight to bear, and it won't grow, and it won't excel, and it won't prosper.
Well, and I would add, we're also human. And so sometimes the facilitators, we're blind to our own humanness, right? And so when you have collective accountability, that's also, and the facilitator is willing to be a student as much as a teacher and as much as a space holder. That's the relaxing of the ego to say, I screwed that up. Let me either in the moment or follow up be able to correct the mistakes that happen in the space. But I think the shared accountability, I think the humility, and I think the willingness to always learn as opposed to thinking I have the answer. Moving from the rightness and the righteousness that often can happen in these spaces to be able to come into a place of humility and admitting when we're wrong.
Yeah, I have a good friend that often quotes being right is overrated. And yeah, that came to mind as you were just sharing. So we're going to go to another question from Sophie Bells. Thank you for your question, Sophie, and for joining us. And her question is, as someone who appears extremely level-headed and has an impressive amount of self-control, how do you find your release? And what does that look like when maybe you don't always feel like you can remain calm?
That's a really good question. Yeah, 2 weeks ago when I was preparing for my TEDx, I don't think I was in this calm and level-headedness. I think part of this is as we do this work and as we get older, time, and it's not an age thing, it's just a time thing. We learn, at least I'll speak for myself, I learn to gauge when I'm losing control and when I'm in that place of self-control. For me, especially being down here in Nashville, what I often do is when I feel stuck or I feel in my emotions, or I am losing it over something, and I know what my triggers are, what are going to take me to the uncontrollable place, I get in my car, I go to the mountains, and I yell or I scream. And then I just allow myself to just be with it. I also have an amazing community of friends that'll often go and just share what's up for me, and we are often at such as a similar energetic level that we can really hear and receive each other, and we're usually not losing our cool at the same time, so we can bring each other off the ledge. I'm not a sitting still meditator. I'm more of a movement meditator, and often for me, it's also, if I need to, I just release through dance. So, yeah.
That's definitely one of my personal releases.
Yeah, cool.
Moving to another question we got from Mauricio. His question is, how can we show compassion and love towards our Native American communities?
I really appreciate this question. I'm trying to think about which angle how I want to approach this. I think first and foremost, we have to acknowledge a travesty of what was taken and what was stolen. First and foremost. I think we also need to not continue to steal the traditions from these cultures. I think we need to not view this as different either, where especially since so many folks who are indigenous in this country are on reservations, who often have subpar services, subpar access, and are viewed as an other. So I think we have to just get right with that. And then we have to look at how we are living in community together. I think we also, as more people are learning indigenous practices and learning the ways of the indigenous world and historic, to really pay attention to the lessons that we're taught, that as we are in climate crisis, as we are in turmoil with each other, there are other ways to address these issues that we might learn if we go to ancient wisdom and indigenous wisdom. But I think the other thing is, as much as we are a culture that will take, the other question is, how are we giving back? How are we giving back in terms of resources? How are we giving back in terms of volunteering, giving support? As I go to the reservation, I'm very conscious that I don't have enough of the blood in me to be able to really call myself Cherokee, but I do have Cherokee blood in me. When I go, I respect the land. I respect the wisdom that comes through. I acknowledge where it comes from. But the next step is for me going to the community and saying, how can I help? How can I be of service? And how can I lift this community up so it has what it needs? And if more of us do that, then I think we have more of the opportunities to be able to come with love and compassion. I hope I answered that okay.
I think it was a beautiful response. So thank you for your answer, and thank you for the question, Mauricio. We also received a question from Jesse, and his question and comment was, I love all of this. I think I naturally want to do this, but being the quote unquote formalized facilitator helps me control my emotion. Any recommendations on how to help with controlling the personal emotions that may come up with engaging people at this level? Just to make it clear, I cry a lot when I am allowing myself to drift into this place of being. Hope that makes sense.
I appreciate that question. I was talking to a friend of mine at an insurance company. They were doing a conversation on purpose for women, and one of the women started crying. There wasn't a facilitator, and there was judgment. There was judgment for how could you cry? And I asked her, I said, so when you brought this group together, were they wearing their corporate hats, their leader hats, or their human hats? And I think the question is, as we create space together, what permission are we giving people? Corporate, leadership, or human? I think when we allow people to be human, then the expression of crying for men, women, or those who don't identify as either is okay. We often have more latitude when we're getting out of our performative roles that tell us we are supposed to act like this. So I want to translate that back to being the facilitator. Now, as a minister, I do weddings. I cry at every wedding. I can't help it. When I see true love happening before me, or I see acts of compassion, especially from men, I always cry. And I think we have to look at, as a facilitator, what messages are we telling ourselves of what we can and cannot do? 2, what are we bringing into the space to allow everyone to be able to be in their full emotional expression? The more we give permission to both the people in the space that we're holding and to ourselves, and often I find that the more human I make myself to the spaces that I hold, the more latitude that I have, but also the more authentic our connection in the space. When I hold the formalized facilitator role and it is rigid, I often get the head-based conversations, the performative-based conversations. One of the ground rules I have in every facilitation that I do is you are not allowed to give an elevator pitch at any point in anything I hold. It's one of the only rules I have. But I say it in a nice way. I say it like an agreement that we have is we want to see you, we want to hear about you more than we want to hear about what you do. Because often we have been so socialized to tell everyone what we do, what we've achieved, where we work, and how smart we are, because that's what we've been told is what's most important. Yet, like where I started today, I'm a bunny owner. I mean, that's part of who I am. That's what gets us to be real, and that's what gets us to be human. Well, the more that we show who we are, and less about what we do.
I love that, Sean. I think that it also it speaks to the need for us to allow people to express themselves that's going to serve them well, and that can look different from one person to the next. And so the judgment, the blaming, definitely needs to find its way outside of spaces where we have people, because otherwise that sense of humanity is not going to come forth. And I think that one of the greatest things that leaders can do for people that fall under their leadership is to extend themselves to a place to where they give themselves that permission to be vulnerable, to be authentic, because then it'll trickle down, right? And others will also allow themselves to be vulnerable. And I think that's where we can realize greatest level of shift and transformation. But if we all are masking and putting on a facade and covering and not really fully being ourselves, then it's going to show forth, and it's going to be to the detriment of all of those who are involved. And so I appreciate you amplifying that. I want to go back to something you said early on, and it was about accessibility and how healing work is presumed to be available, more easily accessible and available to those who are elite, right? And I shared that even when we think about mental health and how the need for therapy has increased because of all that's going on and all that people are dealing with, whether it's grief or the pandemic or, just the uncertainty around so many issues, that therapy is quite expensive, and it's not necessarily in reach for those who most need it oftentimes. When you consider a lot of those who are part of marginalized communities and how they carry that oppression and the trauma, and they're easily triggered because of just what they have experienced, it makes me sad to think that sometimes the accessibility of being able to care for self and mental health is not quite as available. And so I know that you shared that as well, and I just want to get you to respond and react to that.
One of the when I was doing the TED, it was all channeled. I mean, I don't remember most of what I said, but I do remember one line I said, which was, healing and well-being should not be dedicated and relegated to the elite.
Yeah.
And so that's, and I think it's often, I think we're really moving to this place of multimodal ways of healing, right? So we've got therapy, we've got yoga, we've got mindfulness, we've got breath work, we've got embodied practice, and so on and so on, and we just continue to find new ways to bring embodied healing, embodied wisdom, and really healing mind, body, spirit. And these are often created and gone through particular communities. But the communities where there's resources, the communities where there's privilege, the communities where it's that like-minded perspective, right? And so I think the opportunity is, as we do our healing work, then the question becomes, what's our responsibility to bring healing to others? So the way I look at it is, as we, this work is about finding yourself, finding your authentic voice, finding your gifts, your natural gifts, your spiritual gifts, and then without ego saying, now what's my way of contributing in the world? To get to our authentic self is often the healing journey for each of us. So as we start to understand our gifts and we start to understand the struggle of our own stories, that's often a place where we can start to give back to others. And so I think, but a piece of this is, how do we help others find their authentic voice? How do we help others find their compassionate healing that they need? And from that place, we can start to say, so where are the systems and institutions breaking down that are not giving access across the board? Where can we say, I'm getting this, but folks over here, they're getting a watered down version of what I got over here? What if we didn't water down the version of what I have access to? And we actually started to look at, now let's go to the systems and say, how can we create scalable systems across the board? I think we're starting to do that in some pretty interesting and profound ways. But flip side is we have a lot more work to do. So.
Absolutely, a lot more work to do. This has been an incredible hour. One of the final questions that we often like to present to our guest co-host is, we've talked about a lot, but there's a lot still that we didn't get a chance to cover. Is there something that you want to leave us with that you have a lot of passion for right now that you think would be to the benefit of this community hearing? What have we not asked you about that you want to share?
So I think the other piece of the work I do, going from Wall Street to Eileen Fisher and seeing the transforming power that feminine culture and energy had on men, the compassion makes the warrior. While it was for everyone, there's a particular message in it for men, which is, what is the healing work and what's the access that men need to have to be able to do their inner healing work? It's often, there's more access for women, there's more permission for women, and there's less of a stigma for women to do this work, right? And I find that often this work can come from a hyper-masculine perspective, to beat the emotions out of you. It can come from a perspective that emasculates the masculine. I think there's something in the middle that actually allows us to be in the strength of the masculine with the gentleness of the feminine, but the power of both, when we are actually in balance of the head and the heart, the action and receiving, and the fact that we all have the masculine and feminine energy within us. It becomes so conflated with the constructs of masculinity and femininity, and then we genderize it. So then we lose sight of what those energies actually are. But I think in particular, and I literally was talking to a chief of police about how to help cadets out of the academy tap into their integrated masculine feminine, and he didn't flinch. But I think this is the work that's ahead of us, is being able, and I often say, it doesn't matter what we call it.
Right.
The whole idea is, how do we elevate the energies within us that have been suppressed? We call it the yin and yang, the head and heart, so that we are actually able to come into full balance as human beings and have an agility that whatever is thrown at us in the world and in life, we can dance between those energies, and we can move from this mindset of trying to fix a problem to trying to heal the wounds that are embedded at the root of so many of our systems. And if we stop trying to fix them and start trying to heal them, we'll actually put the resources in that are required.
I love that, dancing between energies. That's going to be a new phrase that I go to.
It's up there with the bunny dads. But nonetheless, this has been such a great hour of really enlightening conversation. And again, I hope that you'll get a chance to go back and take a look at the chat. Lots of great affirmation for what you've shared today. People are describing this as almost a group healing session. And I think about when you talked about how the facilitator kind of helps set the tone. And that's precisely what you've done for this conversation. I feel like myself and Natasha and everybody has really followed your lead. And that's been a gift to this hour. And so we appreciate you, Sean, for coming and sharing. We appreciate the work that you do. And let us know how we can support you going forward. So thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And thank you to each of you for joining us today. We hope that you will join us again next week. And again, I'll be taking a step back, and Natasha's going to lead that conversation, and I'll be a student learning. And we just look forward to continuing to hold space for this community week after week. So thank you all so very much. Have a great weekend.
Thank you all.